The oak tree swayed violently in the wind, and perched 30 feet above the ground, Elias Thornwood's cabin swayed with it. Other trappers had laughed when he began building upward instead of on solid earth, calling it a fool's gamble that would cost him his life. But now, as the worst storm system in Montana Territory history entered its 28th consecutive day, every ground-level cabin within 20 miles had either flooded, collapsed, or been abandoned. Only Elias's impossible treetop fortress remained standing, and what he had learned about survival in those brutal weeks would change how men built shelters across the entire Rocky Mountain frontier. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories of frontier innovation and survival against impossible odds move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode will leave you speechless. The rain had been falling for 3 weeks without pause when Elias Thornwood realized he might be the only man left alive in the valley. From his elevated cabin, secured to 3 massive Douglas firs 30 feet above what used to be a mountain meadow, he watched the swollen creek below transform into a raging river. The water had risen 17 feet in the past 10 days, submerging every ground-level structure within sight. Where Thomas Garrett's cabin once stood, only the peak of a collapsed roof remained visible, dark logs jutting from brown floodwater like the ribs of a drowned beast. Elias pressed his hand against the cabin wall, feeling the gentle sway as wind pushed through the trees. The motion had terrified him the first month after construction, but now it felt natural, almost comforting. The cabin moved because the trees moved, and the trees had survived centuries of storms by bending rather than breaking. He had bet his life on that principle, and so far, the bet was paying off. The year was 1839, and the Rocky Mountain fur trade was still profitable enough to draw men willing to risk everything for beaver pelts. Elias had arrived in Montana Territory 4 years earlier, establishing his trap lines along the tributaries of what the locals called Thornwood Creek, a name that predated his arrival but seemed prophetically appropriate. He had been successful, careful, and unremarkably conventional in every aspect of wilderness survival, except one. He built his cabin in the trees. The decision had not come from inspiration or innovation, but from desperation born of experience. During his second winter, Elias had watched spring flooding destroy 2 months of work when runoff from the mountain snowpack turned the valley into a temporary lake. His cabin had survived, but barely, with water reaching within inches of his sleeping platform and ruining most of his stored supplies. The experience taught him that the greatest danger in this particular valley was not cold, bears, or hostile encounters, but water. Most trappers responded to flooding by building on slightly higher ground or constructing raised platforms a few feet above the valley floor. Elias considered those solutions and rejected them as inadequate. Slight elevation provided slight protection. He needed absolute elevation, complete separation from the ground-level dangers that killed men and destroyed property. The idea seemed insane when it first occurred to him, but the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. Trees were nature's towers, already built, already tested by centuries of weather. If he could build a cabin strong enough to anchor to the trees and light enough not to strain them, he could create a shelter that floods could never reach. The construction had taken Elias 4 months of obsessive work during the summer and fall of 1838. He began by selecting the trees, which proved more difficult than he anticipated. The cabin needed 3 anchor points for stability, forming a triangle that would distribute weight evenly. The trees had to be massive enough to support the structure, healthy enough to survive the intrusion of bolts and brackets, and positioned close enough together that the cabin span would not require impossibly long beams. He found his 3 trees on a slight rise above the creek, each a Douglas fir with a trunk diameter exceeding 4 feet. The trees stood in a nearly perfect triangular formation with sides measuring roughly 18 feet, 20 feet, and 22 feet. Elias spent 2 weeks simply observing them, watching how they moved in wind, checking for rot or weakness, and calculating whether their root systems were deep enough to handle additional weight without toppling. The actual construction required solving problems no other trapper had faced. Ground-level cabins rested on earth, with gravity holding everything in place. An elevated cabin needed to be secured against gravity, wind, and the constant motion of living trees. Elias designed a platform system using the strongest beams he could cut from nearby timber, each beam at least 12 inches square and 20 feet long. He notched these beams to wrap partially around each anchor tree, then drilled through both beam and tree to insert iron bolts he had purchased at considerable expense from a trading post 80 miles away. The bolts were crucial. Rope would rot, leather would stretch, and wooden pegs would work loose from constant motion. Iron bolts, each 3/4 of an inch thick and 18 inches long, could be driven completely through tree and beam, then secured with washers and nuts on the far side. Elias used 16 bolts total, distributing them across the 3 anchor points. The cost had consumed most of his previous season's profits, but he considered the investment non-negotiable. Once the primary support beams were secured, he built a triangular platform framework, connecting the 3 anchor points with additional crossbeams. This created a stable base, approximately 16 feet on each side, large enough for a modest cabin, but small enough that the trees could support the weight. The platform itself consisted of split logs laid perpendicular to the support beams, fitted tightly together and secured with smaller iron spikes. Building the cabin walls on an elevated platform presented unique challenges. Elias could not simply stack logs as he would on the ground, because any mistake would result in materials falling 30 feet to the forest floor. He developed a pulley system using rope and a block attached to a branch above the construction site, allowing him to haul logs up one at a time. Each log had to be positioned, notched, and secured before he could bring up the next one. The process was exhausting and dangerous, requiring absolute concentration for hours each day. The walls rose slowly, one log at a time, through late summer and into early autumn. Elias used a modified notching technique that locked each log into place more securely than traditional corner joints. He had studied cabin construction from an old carpenter named William Mackenzie, who had built homes in Pennsylvania before coming west. Mackenzie had shown him how proper joinery could make a structure significantly stronger than simple stacking, and Elias adapted those principles for his elevated design. Each wall log was roughly 14 feet long and 8 inches in diameter, carefully selected for straightness and stripped of bark to prevent insect infestation. Elias notched the ends so they interlocked with perpendicular logs, creating corners that could not pull apart even under stress. He also drilled through the logs at regular intervals, inserting wooden pins that connected each new log to the one below it. The pins were cut from seasoned oak, a wood that would not shrink or crack with age, and they added tremendous rigidity to the structure. The cabin took shape as a simple rectangular structure, 14 feet by 12 feet on the interior, with walls rising to a height of 7 feet. Elias built the walls slightly higher than typical ground cabins because he knew the elevated position would make the interior feel more cramped, and he wanted adequate headroom. The roof presented another engineering challenge, as it needed to be both waterproof and light enough not to overburden the trees. He constructed a peaked roof frame using lighter timber, creating a steep angle that would shed rain and snow efficiently. For the roof covering, he rejected the traditional bark and pole construction used by most trappers. Bark roofs leaked eventually, and in an elevated cabin, any water intrusion would be disastrous, since he could not simply let it drain through a dirt floor. Instead, Elias purchased canvas at the trading post, heavy duck canvas meant for wagon covers, and treated it with a mixture of pine pitch and animal fat to make it waterproof. He laid the canvas over the roof frame in overlapping sections, securing it with thin wooden battens nailed through the fabric into the frame beneath. The result was genuinely waterproof, flexible enough to accommodate the cabin's movement, and light enough not to add excessive weight. The entire roof system weighed less than half what a traditional bark and pole roof would have weighed, a critical consideration for a structure suspended in trees. The door required particular attention. It needed to be strong enough to provide security, but not so heavy that it would strain the cabin structure. Elias built it from vertical planks, backed with horizontal cross-bracing, using iron hinges that he mounted to a reinforced door frame integrated into the wall logs. He added an interior bar that dropped into iron brackets, creating a lock that could not be forced from outside. The door opened inward to prevent wind from blowing it open during storms. The window was perhaps the most controversial element of Elias's design. Most mountain cabins either had no window at all or used a simple opening covered with rawhide or oiled paper. Elias wanted actual glass, which was expensive, fragile, and nearly impossible to transport safely through hundreds of miles of wilderness. He had ordered 2 small panes, each roughly 12 inches square, from the trading post, paying an outrageous price and waiting 3 months for them to arrive from St. Louis. The glass panes arrived wrapped in layers of cloth and straw, somehow surviving the journey intact. Elias built a frame for them using carefully planed wood, creating a double window that could be opened in warm weather and secured shut during storms. He installed heavy wooden shutters on the interior that could be closed and barred, protecting the glass from damage and providing additional insulation during winter. The window faced east, allowing morning sunlight to illuminate the cabin's interior and providing a view of the valley below. By late October of 1838, the cabin was complete. Elias had spent nearly 4 months of continuous work and exhausted his savings on materials, but he now possessed something unique in Montana territory: a shelter that was absolutely protected from flooding, difficult for bears or other predators to access, and built with enough structural integrity to withstand the harsh mountain weather. He moved his supplies up using the pulley system, furnishing the interior with a sleeping platform, a small sheet metal stove with a chimney that vented through the roof, storage shelves, and his basic tools and equipment. The first night in the elevated cabin felt surreal. Elias lay on his sleeping platform, listening to the wind move through the trees and feeling the gentle sway of the structure. Every creak and shift made him wonder if the bolts would hold, if the beams would crack, if the entire construction would suddenly tear free and plummet to the ground. But the night passed without incident, and the morning sun through his glass window revealed the valley below exactly as he had left it, now visible from a perspective no trapper had ever experienced from their home. Other trappers who saw the cabin reacted with a mixture of amusement and concern. Thomas Garrett, who ran trap lines adjacent to Elias's territory, climbed up to inspect the construction and pronounced it impressive but ultimately foolish. He argued that the time and money Elias had invested could have built 3 conventional cabins, and that the elevated position would make the structure more vulnerable to wind damage, not less. William Mackenzie, the old carpenter, examined the joinery and admitted it was solid work, but questioned whether the trees would remain healthy with iron bolts driven through their trunks. Most other trappers simply thought Elias had lost his mind, building a cabin that required a rope ladder to access and swayed in every strong breeze. Elias spent the winter of 1838 to 1839 in his treetop cabin, and the experience taught him lessons he had not anticipated. The elevated position made the cabin noticeably colder than ground-level structures, as it was fully exposed to wind from all directions. Ground cabins benefited from earth insulation and protection from surrounding terrain, advantages Elias had sacrificed for flood protection. He compensated by being more aggressive with insulation, packing every gap between logs with a mixture of clay, moss, and animal hair, creating a seal that was tighter than most conventional cabins achieved. The stove worked well but required more fuel than expected because heat escaped more readily in the exposed position. Elias found himself spending additional time cutting firewood, a task made more difficult by the need to haul everything up to the cabin using his pulley system. He developed a technique of cutting wood into standardized lengths that fit easily through the pulley harness, stacking the loads carefully to maximize efficiency. The mechanic center, physical labor was exhausting, but it kept him warm during the coldest months. The cabin's movement in wind remained the most psychologically challenging aspect of elevated living. During strong storms, the entire structure would sway several inches in each direction, creating a sensation similar to being on a ship in rough seas. Elias learned to move with the motion rather than fighting it, and over time, he found the gentle rocking almost soothing during moderate winds. Only during the most violent storms did the movement become truly frightening, and even then, he trusted his construction enough to sleep through conditions that would have kept him awake in a ground cabin. Spring came late in 1839, with snow lingering into April and the first green shoots not appearing until early May. The snowmelt created the usual spring flooding, but from his elevated position, Elias watched the rising water with detachment rather than concern. The creek swelled and spread across the valley floor, submerging the areas where conventional cabins would have been built. Thomas Garrett's cabin, constructed on what was considered high ground, took on 6 inches of water. Other trappers in the region lost supplies, equipment, and in 2 cases their entire cabins to the spring flood. Elias remained completely dry, 30 feet above the high water mark, watching the temporary lake that formed below his trees. He could see fish swimming through the submerged meadow grass, and he actually lowered fishing lines from his cabin, catching trout without leaving home. The experience vindicated his design philosophy completely. While other trappers scrambled to save their property and rebuild after the water receded, Elias simply waited for the flood to pass, secure in his fortress above the chaos. The summer of 1839 brought good weather and good trapping. Elias worked his trap lines successfully, accumulating beaver pelts that would fetch premium prices when the trading caravan arrived in autumn. He made minor improvements to his cabin, reinforcing sections that had shown weakness during the winter and adding additional storage. The storm season began in late September of 1839, with heavy rains that seemed ordinary at first. Mountain weather was always unpredictable, and autumn storms were common as cold air from the north collided with the last warm systems moving up from lower elevations. Elias had experienced similar weather patterns during his previous years in the territory, and he prepared his cabin as he always did, securing loose items, checking his firewood supply, and ensuring his food stores were adequate. But this storm system was different. The rain that began on September 23rd never stopped. Day after day, heavy clouds rolled through the valley, dumping water with relentless consistency. The creek began rising immediately, swelling beyond its banks within the first week. Elias watched from his window as the water crept higher each day, submerging first the low meadow areas, then the slightly elevated ground where most cabins were built, then rising into territory that experienced flooding only once or twice per decade. By the end of the first week, Thomas Garrett appeared at the base of Elias's tree, shouting up through the rain. His cabin was taking on water and he needed shelter. Elias lowered the rope ladder, and Thomas climbed up, soaked and exhausted, carrying a pack with his most valuable possessions. The 2 men had never been particularly close, but frontier survival created bonds that transcended personal preference. Elias made space for Thomas, and they settled into an uneasy cohabitation as the rain continued to fall. The cabin, designed for 1 person, felt cramped with 2 occupants, but it functioned adequately. The men established routines that minimized conflict, taking turns cooking on the small stove, sharing the sleeping platform in shifts, and maintaining the careful rationing of supplies that extended survival became necessary as the storm showed no signs of ending. Thomas, who had initially mocked the elevated cabin design, now admitted that Elias had been correct. His own cabin was completely submerged, and everything he had not carried up the ladder was lost to the floodwaters. Other trappers in the valley faced similar or worse situations. William Mackenzie had built his cabin on what he considered the highest safe ground in the region, but even his location was threatened as the water continued rising. He abandoned his structure during the second week, taking his most essential supplies and moving to higher elevation, building a temporary shelter in the foothills where the flooding could not reach. 2 younger trappers, brothers named Daniel and Joseph Whitmore, tried to wait out the storm in their cabin, but it collapsed during a particularly violent night of wind and rain. They survived but lost everything, forced to make their way to the trading post 60 miles away with only the clothes they wore. Elias and Thomas watched these events unfold from their elevated vantage point, feeling simultaneously fortunate and guilty. They were safe and dry while others suffered, protected by a design that had seemed excessive just months earlier. The third week of continuous rain brought new challenges that tested the cabin's design in ways Elias had not anticipated. The wind, which had been relatively moderate during the first 2 weeks, intensified dramatically. Gusts, strong enough to bend the massive Douglas firs, began hitting the valley with increasing frequency, and the cabin's movement became severe enough that both men struggled to maintain balance inside. Objects that had been stable for months suddenly needed to be secured, and the constant swaying made sleep difficult even for Elias, who had grown accustomed to normal movement. The trees themselves became the critical factor in survival. Elias had chosen Douglas firs specifically because of their flexibility and deep root systems, characteristics that allowed them to withstand high winds without breaking. As the storm intensified, he watched the anchor trees bend in ways that seemed impossible, their tops swaying 20 or 30 feet from vertical while the trunks flexed like enormous springs. The cabin moved with them, rising and falling, tilting and swaying, but the structure itself remained intact. The iron bolts held without shifting, the platform beams stayed secured to the trees, and the cabin walls showed no signs of separation or structural failure. Thomas spent most of the third week in a state of barely controlled terror. He had not experienced the gradual acclimation that Elias had gone through during the cabin's first months, and the violent motion during storm peaks convinced him they were moments away from catastrophic failure. He would grip the wall logs with white knuckles, muttering prayers and watching the ceiling as if expecting it to tear apart. Elias tried to reassure him by explaining the engineering principles, demonstrating how the movement was actually protecting them by dissipating force rather than resisting it, but Thomas remained unconvinced until the motion stopped. The rain continued with only brief pauses, and the floodwaters below reached levels that old-timers at the trading post would later say exceeded anything in living memory. The entire valley floor disappeared beneath brown water that flowed with visible current, carrying debris from upstream. Whole trees tumbled past, along with sections of destroyed cabins, animal carcasses, and unidentifiable wreckage from higher elevations. Elias estimated the water depth at over 20 feet in areas that were normally dry meadow, which meant his cabin was now suspended 50 feet above the flood surface. The isolation became oppressive as the storm entered its fourth week. Elias and Thomas had no contact with other survivors, no way to know who had made it to safety and who had been caught by rising water or collapsing structures. They maintained their routines mechanically, rationing supplies, keeping the stove burning, and taking turns watching through the window for any change in conditions. The constant dim light, the endless sound of rain on the canvas roof, and the perpetual motion of the cabin created a dreamlike state where time seemed to lose meaning. Supplies began running low during the 26th day of continuous rain. Elias had stocked the cabin for one person surviving a normal winter, not two people enduring a month-long siege. Food rationing became critical as they entered the final days of the storm. Elias and Thomas reduced their meals to twice per day, eating portions that barely qualified as adequate. They had flour, dried beans, salt pork, and some preserved vegetables, but at their current consumption rate, supplies would last perhaps another 10 days. The situation forced difficult calculations about risk versus reward. They could continue rationing and hope the storm ended soon, or one of them could attempt to reach the trading post for additional supplies, a journey that would require traveling through flooded terrain and violent weather. Thomas volunteered to make the attempt, arguing that Elias knew the cabin systems better and should remain to maintain it. But Elias refused the offer, pointing out that the journey would be suicidal in current conditions. The floodwaters were too deep and fast-moving to cross safely, visibility was minimal in the constant rain, and the risk of hypothermia was extreme. They would wait, continue rationing, and deal with true hunger if necessary. Both men had experienced worse deprivation during lean winters in the mountains. The psychological strain of confinement proved as challenging as the physical deprivation. Two men who were not close friends, trapped in a 14 by 12-foot space for weeks with nothing to do but wait and worry, inevitably faced tension. Small habits became sources of irritation. Thomas chewed his food loudly. Elias had a tendency to pace when anxious, making the entire cabin shift with his weight. They argued about trivial matters, fell into cold silences that lasted for hours, then reconciled awkwardly when practical necessity required cooperation. On the 28th day, the rain finally began to diminish. The change was subtle at first, a slight reduction in the intensity of water hammering the roof, longer pauses between gusts of wind. By afternoon, the clouds began breaking apart, allowing brief glimpses of sky that both men stared at with an intensity that bordered on religious fervor. They had begun to believe the rain would never stop, that they would be trapped in perpetual storm until supplies ran out and they faced choices too grim to contemplate. By evening, the rain had stopped completely, replaced by cold, clear air that swept through the valley like a benediction. Elias and Thomas stood at the cabin door, breathing the clean air and watching stars appear as darkness fell. The silence felt almost unnatural after weeks of constant rain sounds, Below them, the floodwaters still covered the valley, but the surface was calmer now, reflecting starlight in a way that made the submerged landscape look almost beautiful. They spent that night in a state of cautious optimism, not quite ready to believe the ordeal had truly ended. But morning brought continued clear weather, and by afternoon, they could see the water level beginning to drop. The flood would take days or even weeks to fully recede, but the immediate crisis had passed. They had survived, and the cabin that skeptics had called a fool's gamble had proven to be the only shelter in the valley capable of withstanding nature's assault. The floodwaters receded slowly over the following 2 weeks, revealing a landscape transformed by the storm's fury. What had been a productive valley with established trap, lines, familiar landmarks, and navigable terrain now looked alien and hostile. The flood had scoured the valley floor, moving massive amounts of soil and depositing debris in random patterns that bore no relationship to the original topography. Trees that had stood for decades were gone, either uprooted completely or snapped off at ground level. The creek, which had been a modest waterway perhaps 20 feet wide, had carved a new channel that was broader, deeper, and followed a different course than before. Elias and Thomas descended from the cabin once the water level dropped enough to reveal solid ground. The experience of standing on earth after a month suspended in trees felt strange, almost disorienting. They walked through the transformed valley carefully, assessing damage and looking for any salvageable materials from destroyed structures. Thomas's cabin was completely gone, not even foundation logs remaining to mark where it had stood. The flood had carried it away entirely, along with everything he had left behind. Other cabins in the region had fared similarly or worse. William Mackenzie's structure, built on elevated ground, had survived partially intact but was uninhabitable without major repairs. The roof had collapsed, and the interior was filled with mud and debris that would take weeks to clear. The Whitmore brothers' cabin site showed only scattered logs and personal items wedged into downstream debris piles. Every ground-level structure within 15 miles had been either destroyed or damaged beyond immediate use. Elias's treetop cabin stood completely undamaged, still swaying gently in the breeze 30 feet above ground that now showed clear evidence of how high the water had risen. Mud lines on the anchor trees marked the flood's peak at roughly 23 feet above normal ground level. If Elias had built a conventional cabin, even on raised platform just 10 feet high, it would have been submerged and destroyed. His obsessive over-engineering, the elevation that had seemed excessive and paranoid, had been barely adequate to survive the actual conditions. Word of the cabin's survival spread quickly through the remaining trapper community. Men who had mocked the design now studied it with genuine interest, asking technical questions about construction methods, weight distribution, and material costs. Thomas Garrett became an unexpected advocate, telling anyone who would listen that Elias's elevated design had saved both their lives and explaining the structural principles he had learned during their month of confinement. The trading post operator, a pragmatic businessman named Henry Blackwell, visited the site personally to examine the cabin. He climbed the rope ladder despite his age and considerable weight, inspected the platform, walls, and roof system, then sat in the cabin's interior asking detailed questions about construction sequence, material sources, and total time investment. Blackwell understood that frontier innovations which solved real problems had commercial value, and he recognized that elevated construction might be applicable in other flood-prone areas throughout the territory. The winter of 1839 to 1840 brought profound changes to building practices across the Montana Territory. Trappers and settlers who had lost homes in the Great Flood needed new shelters before the snow arrived, and many incorporated elevated design principles into their reconstruction. Not everyone built full treetop cabins like Elias's structure, but the concept of building above potential flood levels became standard practice in areas with any history of high water. Thomas Garrett built a new cabin using a hybrid approach, constructing a traditional ground-level structure but elevating it on a platform of stacked stone and heavy timbers that raised the floor 12 feet above normal ground level. The design required more initial labor but provided flood protection while maintaining easier access than a tree-mounted cabin. Other trappers adopted similar compromises, finding middle ground between conventional construction and Elias's extreme elevation. Henry Blackwell began stocking iron bolts, heavy canvas, and other materials necessary for elevated construction at his trading post, recognizing the profit potential in supplying the new building trend. He also started offering advice based on what he had learned from examining Elias's cabin, effectively becoming a consultant for elevated construction despite having never built such a structure himself. The commercial success of these materials validated Elias's approach from an economic perspective, proving that the increased cost and effort of elevated building was worthwhile for settlers in flood-prone regions. Elias himself continued living in his treetop cabin for 3 more years, refining the design based on lessons learned during the Great Storm. He added secondary support cables between the anchor trees, installed a more efficient rope and pulley system for moving supplies, and improved the insulation to reduce fuel consumption during winter. The cabin became a landmark in the region, a destination that visitors would trek miles to see, and a practical demonstration that unconventional thinking could solve problems that traditional methods could not address. In 1842, Elias left Montana Territory, drawn by opportunities in the Oregon Territory where land was available under favorable terms for settlers willing to establish permanent farms. He sold his trap lines and equipment but left the cabin standing, and it remained occupied by various trappers and settlers for another 2 decades. The structure that skeptics had predicted would collapse in the first strong wind survived into the 1860s before finally being abandoned as the fur trade died and the region's population shifted to mining and ranching. The story of Elias Thornwood's treetop cabin became part of frontier folklore, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy around campfires and in trading posts across the Rocky Mountains. The core truth remained consistent through all variations: that one man's refusal to accept conventional limitations had created something impossible that proved to be exactly what survival required. In the harshest environment imaginable, when nature unleashed fury beyond any reasonable expectation, the cabin that should have fallen remained standing, a testament to engineering, determination, and the power of thinking differently.